It was a chilly autumn morning, the kind where the air feels crisp and fresh. Captain Richard Harmon, an experienced pilot with over 2 decades of flying under his belt, was about to board Flight 427, heading to Los Angeles. Richard wasn't your average pilot. He had strong opinions on just about everything: politics, social issues, you name it. His colleagues often joked that he should start a podcast called Captain Opinionated. He didn't mind the nickname. In fact, he wore it proudly. As Richard stepped onto the plane, he glanced at the first-class section. It was mostly empty except for one passenger who caught his attention immediately. Sitting there, scrolling through articles on his tablet, was Senator Walter Leavitt. If you followed politics even a little bit, you'd know who Leavitt was. A conservative heavyweight known for his fiery speeches against progressive policies. Leavitt was always in the news. To say their views clashed would be an understatement. Richard couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and irritation bubbling inside him. He took his seat next to the senator. Normally, he wouldn't have thought twice about sharing space with someone like Leavitt. After all, pilots are trained to stay professional no matter what. But today felt different. Maybe it was the tension in the air, or maybe it was something else entirely. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Richard noticed the headline on Leavitt's tablet: Leavitt defends. Crockett controversy amid backlash. Now, Richard knew a thing or two about this so-called Crockett controversy. Sheriff James Crockett, a polarizing figure in law enforcement, had been making headlines for months, accused of misconduct, misuse of power, and worse. Crockett seemed untouchable. And now here was Leavitt defending him publicly, despite mounting evidence against the sheriff. Something about it didn't sit right with Richard. Unable to resist, Richard leaned over casually. "Senator," he said, his tone cool but polite, "I see you're still defending your friend Crockett." Leavitt looked up from his tablet, clearly startled by the interruption. For a moment he seemed unsure how to respond. Then, with a hint of irritation in his voice, he replied, "Friend, I don't know what you're talking about, Captain." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because people seem to think you're pretty close to him. Some might even say too close." The senator's jaw tightened. "Look, I don't owe anyone an explanation for my political stances, especially not a pilot." That comment hit a nerve. Richard sat back in his seat, gripping the armrest slightly tighter than necessary. The atmosphere shifted instantly. What started as a harmless observation quickly turned into a full-blown debate. They talked, or rather argued, about ethics, accountability, and the role of government. Their voices grew louder with each passing minute, drawing curious glances from other passengers nearby. One elderly woman seated across the aisle gave them a disapproving look, while a young man wearing headphones smirked, clearly entertained by the spectacle unfolding before him. Even the flight attendants exchanged worried glances, though they were too busy preparing for the flight to intervene. But Richard wasn't done yet. He leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing. "If you didn't fund Crockett, then why are your financial records tied to him?" For a brief second, Leavitt froze. His face went pale, almost ghostly. Whatever confidence he'd shown earlier vanished completely. Before he could respond, however, the intercom buzzed to life. The captain's voice came through, calm but urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a minor issue. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The announcement sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. Passengers began whispering nervously, wondering what exactly was going on. Richard instinctively reached for his phone, ready to offer assistance if needed. After all, being a pilot meant knowing how to handle emergencies, even when you weren't officially in charge. Leavitt, on the other hand, looked terrified. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edges of his chair. "You've got this, right?" he asked Richard, his voice trembling. Richard hesitated for a split second. Then, with a deep breath, he replied, "I'll do my best." What happened next changed everything, not just for Richard and Leavitt, but for everyone on board. Little did they know the real drama was only beginning. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, the tension between Richard and Leavitt simmered in the background. The senator sat stiffly in his seat, his face pale and his hands gripping the armrests like they were the only things keeping him grounded. Richard, on the other hand, was already up and moving toward the cockpit. He didn't care about protocol or whether it was his job. He just knew something wasn't right. The flight attendants noticed him immediately. One of them approached cautiously, her voice low but urgent. "Sir, is everything okay? Are you authorized to be here?" Richard flashed his pilot's badge quickly. "I'm off duty, but I've got experience. What's going on?" The co-pilot, a young man with sweat beading on his forehead, glanced at Richard with a mix of relief and panic. "We're having hydraulic issues," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "It's affecting our ability to stabilize at high altitudes. Hydraulic failure." Those two words sent a chill down Richard's spine. It wasn't the kind of problem that could be fixed mid-flight with duct tape and prayers. If they didn't act fast, the situation could spiral out of control. Without hesitation, Richard stepped inside the cockpit and took charge. "All right," he said firmly, his tone cutting through the chaos. "Let's focus. First, we need to assess how bad the damage is. Then, we'll figure out our options." The captain, a grizzled veteran who looked like he'd seen his fair share of emergencies, nodded gratefully. Together, they worked as a team, running through checklists and communicating with air traffic control. Richard's calm demeanor helped steady the nerves of everyone in the cockpit. But outside in the cabin, the mood was anything but calm. Back in first class, passengers exchanged worried glances. Some whispered nervously, while others stared out the windows, hoping for any sign that things were under control. Leavitt, still, frozen in his seat, seemed lost in thought. His earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by sheer terror. A middle-aged woman sitting across from him tried to offer reassurance. "It's probably nothing serious," she said softly, though her shaky voice betrayed her own fear. Meanwhile, the flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, reminding everyone to keep their seatbelts fastened. One of them stopped near Leavitt and leaned in slightly. "Senator," she said quietly, "is there anything I can get you? Water, maybe?" Leavitt shook his head, unable to speak. His mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. Would they make it safely to the ground? Or would this be where it all ended? In the cockpit, Richard remained focused. He studied the instruments closely, his sharp eyes catching every detail. They needed to find a safe place to land, and soon. The nearest airport was a small regional one, miles away from their original destination. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best shot. "We're going to have to descend quickly," Richard told the crew, "and we'll need to break through those storm clouds ahead." Storm clouds. Just hearing those words made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Flying through turbulence was never easy, especially with a compromised system. But there was no time to hesitate. With Richard guiding them, the plane began its descent, slicing through the thick gray clouds like a knife. For a few tense moments, visibility dropped to almost zero. All anyone could see was swirling mist and flashes of lightning in the distance. Passengers held their breath, some clutching rosaries or whispering silent prayers. Even the flight attendants stood rigid, gripping the backs of seats to steady themselves. Then suddenly, they broke through the clouds. Below them stretched a narrow runway surrounded by open fields. Relief washed over the cabin as cheers erupted from the passengers. People clapped and hugged each other, grateful to have survived what felt like an eternity of uncertainty. But the celebration was short-lived. As the plane taxied toward the terminal, something unusual caught Richard's eye. Waiting on the tarmac was a group of federal agents dressed in dark uniforms. Their presence was unmistakable and unsettling. "What are they doing here?" the captain muttered under his breath. Richard didn't answer. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was about to unfold. Whatever it wasn't going to be good. As the plane came to a stop on the tarmac, the passengers began to relax. Some even unbuckled their seatbelts, ready to stretch their legs after the nerve-wracking descent. But Richard stayed rooted in his seat near the cockpit, watching the scene unfold outside with growing unease. The group of federal agents standing on the runway wasn't there for routine checks or safety protocols. They looked too serious, too purposeful. One of the agents stepped forward, holding a folded document in his hand. He signaled for the door to be opened, and moments later, he boarded the plane. His eyes scanned the cabin quickly before landing on Senator Leavitt, who was still seated in first class. Without hesitation, the agent walked straight toward him. Senator Walter Leavitt. The man said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You are under arrest for conspiracy and misuse of campaign funds related to Sheriff James Crockett." The words hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted from the passengers, followed by murmurs of disbelief. People craned their necks to get a better look at the senator, who now looked like a deer caught in headlights. Leavitt shot up from his seat, his face red with anger and shock. "This is outrageous," he shouted, pointing a finger at the agent. "I didn't do anything wrong. You're framing me." The agent remained calm but firm. "Sir, please come with us quietly. We have evidence linking you to illegal financial transactions involving Sheriff Crockett." Leavitt continued to protest, his voice rising with every word. "Evidence? What evidence? This is a witch hunt. Political persecution." Richard watched silently from his seat, his mind racing. Part of him felt a strange sense of vindication. After all, he'd confronted Leavitt earlier about those very same allegations. But another part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. Why had these agents shown up so conveniently right after the emergency landing? And why did some of them exchange subtle glances with certain passengers? Before Richard could dwell on it further, a woman approached him. She was tall, with sharp features and an air of determination about her. Her clothes were casual but professional, a jacket slung over her shoulder and a notebook tucked under her arm. "Captain Harmon?" she asked, extending her hand. "I'm Rachel Meyer. I'm an investigative journalist." Richard shook her hand cautiously. "What can I do for you?" Rachel glanced around to make sure no one was listening too closely. Then in a low voice she said, "You need to hear this. There's more to this story than meets the eye." Intrigued and slightly suspicious, Richard nodded. "Go on." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice even more. "I've been researching the connection between Leavitt and Crockett for months. From what I've uncovered, this whole scandal may not be what it seems. Someone orchestrated this, not Leavitt, but someone else entirely. Someone powerful enough to frame a U.S. senator and use the media to destroy his reputation." Richard frowned. "Are you saying Leavitt's innocent?" "I'm saying we don't know yet," Rachel replied firmly. "But if we don't act fast, innocent people will pay the price, and whoever's behind this won't stop until they've covered their tracks completely." Her words sent a chill down Richard's spine. He wanted to dismiss her claims as paranoia, but something in her tone told him she wasn't bluffing. Besides, he'd seen enough during his years as a pilot to know that things weren't always as straightforward as they appeared. "What do you suggest we do?" Richard asked finally. Rachel hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a small USB drive from her pocket. "This contains files I managed to dig up during my investigation. It's incomplete, but it points to a larger network manipulating events from behind the scenes. If we can piece it together." She trailed off, letting the implications sink. Richard stared at the USB drive, weighing his options. On one hand, he was just a pilot, an ordinary guy trying to live an ordinary life. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the possibility that justice wasn't being served here. "Not really." "All right," he said finally. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Together, they decided to start by reviewing the flight manifest. Who else on board stood to gain from Leavitt's downfall? As they pored over the list of passengers, several names raised red flags. There was a businessman seated near Leavitt who frequently traveled to countries known for money laundering. Another passenger claimed to be a teacher but carried advanced surveillance equipment in their carry-on bag. Even one of the flight attendants had questionable background details that didn't quite add up. But the most startling discovery came when Richard reviewed security footage from the airport where they'd landed. In the corner of one grainy frame, barely visible, stood a familiar figure watching the scene unfold. It was none other than Sheriff James Crockett himself. Richard's blood ran cold. "That's him," he whispered, pointing at the screen. "The guy everyone's accusing Leavitt of working with." Rachel's eyes widened. "Do you think he's involved in setting up Leavitt?" "I don't know," Richard admitted. But I'm starting to think this goes deeper than either of us realized. As they stood there, staring at the footage, Richard felt a mix of determination and dread wash over him. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over yet. Far from it. With the image of Sheriff James Crockett burned into his mind, Richard knew they were onto something big. Something dangerous. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but instead of clarity, all he felt was a growing sense of unease. Rachel could see it in his eyes. Hesitation mixed with determination. "We need more proof," she said firmly, breaking the silence. "If we go public without solid evidence, whoever's behind this will crush us." Richard nodded, slowly. He wasn't naive, he understood how powerful people played the game. They covered their tracks, manipulated information, and silenced anyone who got too close. If they were going to expose the truth, they had to be smarter. And faster. "Where do we start?" Richard asked, glancing around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. The airport terminal was buzzing with activity now, passengers milling about, luggage being unloaded, and federal agents escorting Leavitt toward a waiting vehicle. It was chaos, but that same chaos might work in their favor. Rachel tapped her notebook thoughtfully. "We focus on Crockett. If he's here, it means he's involved somehow, maybe even running the show. Let's find out what he's hiding." Using Richard's credentials as a pilot gave them access to restricted areas of the airport, places where ordinary passengers weren't allowed. They moved quickly, sticking to shadows and avoiding eye contact with security personnel. Their first stop was the baggage claim area, where Crockett's luggage had been tagged for inspection. "This is risky," Richard muttered as they approached a conveyor belt lined with suitcases. "If someone sees us—" "I know," Rachel interrupted, her voice low but steady. "But if we don't take the risk, we'll never uncover the truth." They found Crockett's bag easily enough. It stood out because of its expensive leather, exterior, and custom tags. Rachel knelt beside it, pulling out a small toolkit from her jacket pocket. Within seconds, she had popped open the lock. Inside, they discovered documents stuffed haphazardly into folders. Most were financial records, detailing transactions between offshore accounts and shell companies. There were also handwritten notes referencing names Richard didn't recognize, along with cryptic symbols that looked like codes. "What is all this?" Richard whispered, flipping through the pages. "It's proof," Rachel replied, her voice tinged with excitement. "This shows how money has been funneled illegally to support Crockett's operations. And look." She held up a sheet of paper with a list of names. "These are high-profile figures tied to the conspiracy. Some of them are even within the federal agency that arrested Leavitt." Richard's stomach churned. This wasn't just about framing a senator anymore. It was about exposing a web of corruption that reached far beyond anything they'd imagined. But before they could celebrate their discovery, footsteps echoed down the hallway. "Someone's coming," Richard hissed, shoving the documents back into the bag. They barely had time to relock it before two men in dark suits rounded the corner. One of them glanced at the suitcase, then at Richard and Rachel. "What are you doing here?" the taller man demanded, his hand resting casually but ominously on the holster at his side. Thinking fast, Richard stepped forward, flashing his pilot's badge again. "Just checking for any irregularities with passenger belongings." Standard procedure after an emergency landing. The man narrowed his eyes but didn't press further. Instead, he gestured to his partner, who picked up Crockett's bag and carried it away. As soon as they were out of sight, Richard let out a shaky breath. "That was too close," he muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. Rachel nodded grimly. "We can't stay here. Whoever these guys are, they're not regular agents. We've got to move." Their next move took them deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the airport. Rachel led the way, navigating confidently despite the dim lighting and maze-like layout. At one point, they ducked into a maintenance room to avoid a group of uniformed guards patrolling the area. While hiding, Richard noticed something odd. A surveillance camera mounted high on the wall, its red light blinking steadily. "They're watching us," he whispered, pointing upward. "Every step we take is probably being recorded." Rachel cursed under her breath. Then we need to create a distraction. Something big enough to draw attention away from us while we retrieve the evidence. Richard frowned. What kind of distraction? She grinned mischievously. Leave that to me. Minutes later, alarms blared throughout the terminal. Smoke poured from a nearby electrical panel, causing panic among the passengers and staff. People rushed toward exits, shouting and coughing as the fire alarm system kicked in. Amid the confusion, Rachel and Richard slipped unnoticed into a secure storage room where confiscated items were kept. Inside, they found Crockett's bag once again. This time they didn't waste a moment. Rachel grabbed the incriminating documents and shoved them into her backpack. Just as they were about to leave, however, the door burst open. 3 armed men stormed in, their faces masked and their weapons drawn. "Don't move," one of them barked, aiming directly at Richard. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he weighed his options, fight or flight. Before he could decide, Rachel acted. She hurled a heavy toolbox at the nearest intruder, catching him off guard. In the ensuing chaos, Richard tackled another man, sending both of them crashing to the floor. The third assailant hesitated, giving Rachel just enough time to grab a fire extinguisher and swing it with all her might. The fight was short but brutal. By the time it ended, the attackers lay unconscious on the ground. Richard and Rachel didn't stick around to ask questions. They bolted out of the room and ran toward the nearest exit. Outside, the cool night air hit them like a slap. Their lungs burned from exertion, and adrenaline still coursed through their veins. But they weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. As they sprinted across the tarmac, Rachel glanced over her shoulder. "There's a plane parked over there," she said, pointing to a small aircraft used for private charters. "Can you fly it?" Richard followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "I can try." Without another word, they climbed aboard. Richard fired up the engines, his hands moving instinctively over the controls. Behind them, shouts rang out as their pursuers realized what was happening. Bullets pinged off the fuselage as they sped down the runway, narrowly avoiding disaster. When the wheels finally lifted off the ground, Richard exhaled deeply. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself a moment of relief. But he knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Whatever awaited them next, it wouldn't be easy. The small plane roared through the night sky, its engines straining against the weight of the truth they carried. Richard gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white as he focused on keeping the aircraft steady. Behind him, Rachel clutched her backpack like it was a lifeline, her eyes darting between the horizon and the rear window, half expecting their pursuers to appear out of nowhere. "They'll come after us," she said finally, breaking the tense silence. "Guys like that don't give up easily." Richard didn't respond right away. He knew she was right. The men back at the airport weren't ordinary thugs. They were professionals, trained to track down loose ends and tie them off, permanently. And now, thanks to their daring escape, Richard and Rachel had become the biggest loose ends of all. "We've got a head start," Richard replied eventually, his voice calm but firm. "That's something. Plus, we've got evidence. If we can get it into the right hands, we might actually stand a chance." Rachel nodded, though she didn't look convinced. She opened her backpack carefully, pulling out the stolen documents. Even in the dim light of the cockpit, she could see how damning they were. Bank statements, emails, handwritten notes. It was enough to implicate some of the most powerful people in the country. But getting it to the right people wasn't going to be easy. Whoever these shadowy figures were, they clearly had connections everywhere, including law enforcement and government agencies. "So, where are we headed?" Rachel asked, trying to keep her tone light despite the gravity of their situation. "There's an airstrip about 50 miles from here," Richard explained. "It's remote, used mostly by whistleblowers or journalists who need a safe place to land. We'll regroup there and figure out our next move." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You seem pretty knowledgeable about secret airstrips." Richard smirked, faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Let's just say I've been flying long enough to know where to go when things get complicated." For a while, neither of them spoke. The hum of the engine filled the silence as the plane cut through the darkness. Below them, the landscape stretched endlessly. Fields, forests, and winding rivers bathed in moonlight. It was almost peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos they'd left behind. But peace was fleeting. As they approached the airstrip, Rachel spotted headlights moving along the dirt road leading to the landing area. Richard?" she said cautiously, pointing downward. "Are those cars supposed to be there?" Richard squinted, his stomach sinking as he realized what she meant. Several vehicles were parked near the runway, their engines idling. Figures moved around them, carrying equipment that looked suspiciously like weapons. "Looks like they beat us here," Richard muttered, under his breath. "Damn it. What do we do now?" Rachel asked, her voice tinged with panic. "We can't exactly turn back?" "No," Richard agreed grimly. "But we also can't land there, not without walking straight into a trap." He scanned the terrain below, searching for another option. There wasn't much time. The fuel gauge was dropping steadily, and they couldn't stay airborne forever. Finally, his eyes landed on a patch of flat ground not far from the airstrip. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to work. "Hold on tight," he warned, adjusting the controls. "This is going to get bumpy." Rachel braced herself as the plane descended sharply, veering away from the airstrip toward the open field. The landing gear groaned in protest as Richard maneuvered the aircraft onto uneven ground. Dust kicked up in clouds as the tires skidded across the surface, sending the plane bouncing violently before finally coming to a stop. Neither of them moved for a moment, catching their breath and assessing whether they were still in one piece. Then, without a word, they grabbed their belongings and scrambled out of the plane. The cool night air hit them instantly, sharp and refreshing after hours cooped up in the cramped cockpit. "This way," Richard whispered, gesturing toward a cluster of trees nearby. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows as they put distance between themselves and the abandoned plane. Behind them, shouts erupted as their pursuers realized what had happened. Flashlights swept across the field, illuminating the wreckage. "They're coming!" Rachel hissed, ducking low as a beam of light passed dangerously close to them. Richard nodded, urging her forward. "Keep moving. Don't stop." They pushed deeper into the woods, their footsteps crunching softly against fallen leaves and twigs. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet night, making them hyper-aware of their surroundings. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin tucked among the trees. Its windows were boarded up and the roof sagged under years of neglect, but it offered shelter. "In here," Richard said, pushing open the creaky door. Inside, the air smelled musty, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like ghostly curtains. Still, it was better than being out in the open. Once inside, Rachel dumped the contents of her backpack onto a dusty wooden table. She spread the documents out, examining each page carefully. "We need to prioritize," she said, her voice steadier now. "Figure out which pieces of evidence will cause the most damage if leaked." Richard leaned over her shoulder, scanning the papers. "Start with the names. If we can link these guys to the conspiracy directly, it'll blow everything wide open." As Rachel sorted through the files, Richard kept watch by the window, peering out into the darkness. His mind raced. Who exactly were they dealing with? How deep did this conspiracy go? And why had Crockett gone to such lengths to frame Leavitt? "These people aren't messing around," Rachel said suddenly, snapping him out of his thoughts. She held up a document detailing illegal arms deals tied to one of the names on the list. "If we expose this, it won't just bring down a few corrupt officials, it'll shake the entire system." Richard sighed heavily. "Then we'd better make sure we survive long enough to do it." Outside, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Footsteps crunched through the underbrush, accompanied by muffled voices. Whoever was chasing them was closing in fast. Rachel glanced at Richard, her expression resolute. "We can't let them win." "We won't," Richard promised, grabbing a heavy piece of wood from the corner of the cabin. "Not tonight." And with that, they prepared to face whatever or whoever was waiting for them beyond the trees. The cabin was silent except for the faint creak of the wooden floorboards beneath their feet. Richard stood by the window, gripping the piece of wood like a bat, while Rachel worked feverishly at the table, organizing the evidence into piles. The footsteps outside were getting closer now, too close. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent a jolt through them both. "We need to decide what we're going to do," Rachel whispered urgently, her hands trembling slightly as she shuffled papers. "If they find us here—" "They won't," Richard interrupted firmly, though his voice betrayed a flicker of doubt. He glanced over his shoulder at her. "You keep working on that. I'll handle whoever's out there." Rachel hesitated but nodded. She trusted him even if the situation felt impossible. As she continued sorting through the documents, Richard moved to the door, positioning himself behind it. His heart pounded, in his chest each beat echoing like a drum roll in his ears. He could hear voices now, low and deliberate just beyond the tree line. "Over here." One of them called out, their voice cutting through the night air. Richard tightened his grip on the makeshift weapon. He didn't know how many men were out there, but he knew enough to realize this wasn't going to end without a fight. Still, he couldn't let fear take over, not when so much was at stake. A flashlight beam pierced through the darkness, illuminating the front of the cabin. Seconds later, heavy boots crunched against the porch steps. The doorknob rattled violently, but it held firm thanks to Richard's earlier efforts to barricade it with a chair. "This is your last chance," a man shouted from outside. "Come out peacefully and no one gets hurt." Richard rolled his eyes. Peaceful? These guys weren't exactly known for playing fair. He glanced back at Rachel, who gave him a quick nod before stuffing the most critical documents into a small waterproof pouch, just in case. With a deep breath, Richard swung the door open suddenly, catching the first intruder off guard. The man stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. Before he could recover, Richard swung the wooden plank hard, striking him across the chest. The impact sent the man sprawling onto the ground, groaning in pain. Two more figures rushed forward, weapons drawn. Richard ducked behind the doorframe, using it as cover while he scanned for an opening. Bullets whizzed past him, embedding themselves in the walls of the cabin. Splinters flew everywhere, forcing Rachel to dive behind the table for safety. "Get down," Richard yelled, though she didn't need telling twice. Despite the odds, Richard managed to disarm one of the attackers with a well-timed kick to the wrist. The gun clattered to the floor and Richard lunged for it, firing a warning shot into the air. The sudden noise startled the remaining pursuers, giving him just enough time to grab Rachel's arm and pull her toward the back exit. "Let's go," he shouted, shoving the pouch of evidence into her hands. They burst out the rear door and sprinted into the woods, weaving between trees and leaping over roots. Behind them, shouts erupted as their pursuers regrouped and gave chase. The forest was pitch black, lit only by the occasional sliver of moonlight filtering through the canopy above. Each step felt precarious, every sound amplified tenfold. After several minutes of running, Richard spotted a narrow ravine up ahead. It wasn't deep, but it would slow their pursuers down, if they could cross it safely. Without hesitation, he grabbed Rachel's hand and guided her across, helping her scramble up the other side. On the far edge of the ravine, they paused briefly to catch their breath. Rachel leaned against a tree, clutching the pouch tightly to her chest. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat, but her eyes burned with determination. "We can't keep running forever," she panted. "We need to call for help." Richard nodded. "Agreed. But who do we trust?" Rachel thought for a moment, then pulled out her phone. Despite everything, it still had a weak signal. "There's someone, a journalist friend of mine, off the grid, completely independent. If anyone can help us expose this, it's her." She dialed the number quickly, explaining the situation in hushed tones. Whoever was on the other end listened intently before promising to send backup immediately. Hanging up, Rachel turned to Richard with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Help's coming," she said simply. But help wouldn't arrive fast enough. Within minutes, their pursuers caught sight of them again. This time there was nowhere left to run. Trapped between a rocky cliff face and the advancing group, Richard and Rachel exchanged a long look. They both knew what was coming next. To everyone's surprise, the lead attacker raised a hand, signaling his men to stop. He stepped forward cautiously, lowering his weapon slightly. Enough of this, he growled. Give us the evidence, and we'll let you walk away. Richard snorted derisively. Yeah, right. Like we'd believe that. The man shrugged, feigning indifference. Suit yourself. But understand this. You're not leaving here alive unless we get what we want. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, without warning, headlights appeared in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of sirens. Backup had arrived. Real backup. Federal agents, local law enforcement, and reporters swarmed the area, surrounding the attackers and forcing them to surrender. As the dust settled, Richard and Rachel handed over the evidence to trusted authorities. Within hours, the story broke nationwide. Leavitt was exonerated, and Crockett, along with his accomplices, was arrested. Powerful figures implicated in the conspiracy faced public scrutiny, their reputations shattered. For Richard, the experience changed everything. He became an advocate for transparency and accountability, using his platform to speak out against corruption. Rachel earned recognition for her bravery, publishing a groundbreaking exposé that shook the foundations of power. As Richard sat in the cockpit of another flight weeks later, he reflected on everything that had happened. Justice had prevailed, but only because ordinary people refused to stay silent, and sometimes that was enough.